Section 7 of The Basis of Morality by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by Arthur Bullock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapters 3 to 5. Chapter 3, Anti-Moral Incentives. The chief and fundamental incentive in man, as in animals, is egoism, that is, the urgent impulse to exist and exist under the best circumstances. The German word Selbstsucht, self-seeking, involves a false secondary idea of disease, Sucht. The term Eigennutz, self-interest, denotes egoism, so far as the latter is guided by reason, which enables it, by means of reflection, to prosecute its purposes systematically, so that animals may be called egoistic, but not self-interested, Eigennutzig. I shall therefore retain the word egoism for the general idea. Now this egoism is, both in animals and men, connected in the closest way with their very essence and being. Indeed, it is one and the same thing. For this reason, all human actions, as a rule, have their origin in egoism, and to it, accordingly, we must always first turn when we try to find the explanation of any given line of conduct. Just as, when the endeavor is made to guide a man in any direction, the means to this end are universally calculated with reference to the same all-powerful motive. Egoism is, from its nature, limitless. The individual is filled with the unqualified desire of preserving his life and of keeping it free from all pain, under which is included all want and privation. He wishes to have the greatest possible amount of pleasurable existence and every gratification that he is capable of appreciating. Indeed, he attempts, if possible, to evolve fresh capacities for enjoyment. Everything that opposes the strivings of his egoism awakens his dislike, his anger, his hate. This is the mortal enemy which he tries to annihilate. If it were possible, he would like to possess everything for his own pleasure. As this is impossible, he wishes at least to control everything. Quote, "All things for me and nothing for others," end quote, is his maxim. Egoism is a huge giant overtopping the world. If each person were allowed to choose between his own destruction and that of the rest of mankind, I need not say what the decision would be in most cases. Thus it is that every human unit makes himself the center of the world, which he views exclusively from that standpoint. Whatever occurs, even, for instance, the most sweeping changes in the destinies of nations, he brings into relation first and foremost with his own interests, which, however slightly and indirectly they may be affected, he is sure to think of before anything else. No sharper contrast can be imagined than that between the profound and exclusive attention which each person devotes to his own self, and the indifference with which, as a rule, all other people regard that self, an indifference precisely like that with which he in turn looks upon them. To a certain extent, it is actually comic to see how each individual out of innumerable multitudes considers himself, at least from the practical point of view, as the only real thing, and all others in some sort as mere phantoms. The ultimate reason of this lies in the fact that everyone is directly conscious of himself, but of others only indirectly, through his mind's eye, and the direct impression asserts its right. In other words, it is in consequence of the subjectivity which is essential to our consciousness that each person is himself the whole world, for all that is objective exists only indirectly, as simply the mental picture of the subject, whence it comes about that everything is invariably expressed in terms of self-consciousness. The only world which the individual really grasps, and of which he has certain knowledge, he carries in himself, as a mirrored image fashioned by his brain, and he is therefore its center. Consequently, he is all in all to himself, and since he feels that he contains within his ego all that is real, nothing can be of greater importance to him than his own self. Moreover, this supremely important self, this microcosm, to which the macrocosm stands in relation as its mere modification or accident, this, which is the individual's whole world, he knows perfectly well must be destroyed by death, which is therefore for him equivalent to the destruction of all things. Such then are the elements out of which, on the basis of the will to live, egoism grows up, and like a broad trench it forms a perennial separation between man and man. If on any occasion someone actually jumps across to help another, such an act is regarded as a sort of miracle, which calls forth amazement and wins approval. In Part 2, Chapter 6, where Kant's principle of morals is discussed, I had the opportunity of describing how egoism behaves in everyday life, where it is always peering out of some corner or other, despite ordinary politeness which, like the traditional fig leaf, is used as a covering. In point of fact, politeness is the conventional and systematic disavowal of egoism in the trifles of daily intercourse, and is, of course, a piece of recognized hypocrisy. Gentle manners are expected and commended because that which they conceal, egoism, is so odious that no one wishes to see it, however much it is known to be there. Just as people like to have repulsive objects hidden at least by a curtain. Now, unless external force, under which must be included every source of fear, whether of human or superhuman powers, or else the real moral incentive is in effective operation, it is certain that egoism always pursues its purpose with unqualified directness. Hence, without these checks, considering the countless number of egoistic individuals, the bellum omnium contra omnes, translator's footnote, the war of all against all, Hobbes uses this expression, end footnote, would be the order of the day and prove the ruin of all. Thus is explained the early construction by reflecting reason of state government, which, arising, as it does, from a mutual fear of reciprocal violence, obviates the disastrous consequences of the general egoism as far as it is possible to do by negative procedure. Where, however, the two forces that oppose egoism fail to be operative, the latter is not slow to reveal all its horrible dimensions, nor is the spectacle exactly attractive. In order to express the strength of this anti-moral power in a few words, to portray it, so to say, at one stroke, some very emphatic hyperbole is wanted. It may be put thus: many a man would be quite capable of killing another, simply to rub his boots over with the victim's fat. I am only doubtful whether this, after all, is any exaggeration. Egoism, then, is the first and principal, though not the only, power that the moral motive has to contend against, and it is surely sufficiently clear that the latter, in order to enter the lists against such an opponent, must be something more real than a hair-splitting sophism or an a priori soap-bubble. In war, the first thing to be done is to know the enemy well, and in the shock of battle, now impending, egoism, as the chief combatant on its own side, is best set against the virtue of justice, which, in my opinion, is the first and original cardinal virtue. The virtue of loving kindness, on the other hand, is rather to be matched with ill will or spitefulness, the origin and successive stages of which we will now consider. Ill will, in its lower degrees, is very frequent, indeed almost a common thing, and it easily rises in the scale. Goethe is assuredly right when he says that in this world indifference and aversion are quite at home. It is very fortunate for us that the cloak, which prudence and politeness throw over this vice, prevents us from seeing how general it is, and how the bellum omnium contra omnes is constantly waged, at least in thought. Yet ever and anon there is some appearance of it, for instance in the relentless backbiting so frequently observed, while its clearest manifestation is found in all outbreaks of anger, which, for the most part, are quite disproportional to their cause, and which could hardly be so violent had they not been compressed, like gunpowder, into the explosive compound formed of long-cherished brooding hatred. Ill will usually arises from the unavoidable collisions of egoism which occur at every step. It is, moreover, objectively excited by the view of the weakness, the folly, the vices, failings, shortcomings, and imperfections of all kinds, which everyone more or less, at least occasionally, affords to others. Indeed, the spectacle is such that many a man, especially in moments of melancholy and depression, may be tempted to regard the world, from the aesthetic standpoint, as a cabinet of caricatures, from the intellectual as a madhouse, and from the moral as a nest of sharpers. If such a mental attitude be indulged, misanthropy is the result. Lastly, one of the chief sources of ill will is envy, or rather, the latter is itself ill will kindled by the happiness, possessions, or advantages of others. No one is absolutely free from envy, and Herodotus said long ago, "Phthonous archithen emphite anthropo." Envy is a natural growth in man from the beginning. But its degrees vary considerably. It is most poisonous and implacable when directed against personal qualities, because then the envious have nothing to hope for. And precisely in such cases its vilest form also appears, because men are made to hate what they ought to love and honor. Yet so, the world wags, even as Petrarca complained, di lor par più che d'altri invidia sabbia, che per se stessi son levati a volo, uscendo fuor della comun gabbia. For envy fastens most of all on those who, rising on their own strong wings, escape the bars wherein the vulgar crowd is caged. The reader is referred to the Parerga, Volume 2, subsection 114, for a more complete examination of envy. In a certain sense, the opposite of envy is the habit of gloating over the misfortunes of others. At any rate, while the former is human, the latter is diabolical. There is no sign more infallible of an entirely bad heart and of profound moral worthlessness than open and candid enjoyment in seeing other people suffer. The man in whom this trait is observed ought to be forever avoided. Hic niger est hunc tu, Romane, capito. Translation: This man is black, of him shalt thou, O Roman, beware. These two vices are in themselves merely theoretical. In practice they become malice and cruelty. It is true that egoism may lead to wickedness and crime of every sort, but the resulting injury and pain to others are simply the means, not the end, and are therefore involved only as an accident. Whereas malice and cruelty make others' misery the end in itself, the realization of which affords distinct pleasure. They therefore constitute a higher degree of moral turpitude. The maxim of egoism at its worst is neminem iuva imo omne si forte conducit. Thus there is always a condition: laede, help nobody, but rather injure all people if it brings you any advantage. The guiding rule of malice is omnes quantum potes laede, injure all people as far as you can. As malicious joy is in fact theoretical cruelty, so, conversely, cruelty is nothing but malicious joy put into practice, and the latter is sure to show itself in the form of cruelty directly an opportunity offers. An examination of the special vices that spring from these two primary antimoral forces forms no part of the present treatise. Its proper place would be found in a detailed system of ethics. From egoism we should probably derive greed, gluttony, lust, selfishness, avarice, covetousness, injustice, hardness of heart, pride, arrogance, etc., while to spitefulness might be ascribed disaffection, envy, ill will, malice, pleasure in seeing others suffer, prying curiosity, slander, insolence, petulance, hatred, anger, treachery, fraud, thirst for revenge, cruelty, etc. The first root is more bestial, the second more devilish, and according as either is the stronger, or according as the moral incentive to be described below predominates, so the salient points for the ethical classification of character are determined. No man is entirely free from some traces of all three. Here I bring to an end my review of these terrible powers of evil. It is an array reminding one of the princes of darkness in Milton's Pandemonium. But my plan, which in this respect of course differs from that of all other moralists, required me to consider at the outset this gloomy side of human nature, and, like Dante, to descend first to Tartarus. It will now be fully apparent how difficult our problem is. We have to find a motive capable of making a man take up a line of conduct directly opposed to all those propensities which lie deeply ingrained in his nature, or, given such conduct as a fact of experience, we must search for a motive capable of supplying an adequate and non-artificial explanation of it. The difficulty, in fact, is so great that, in order to solve it, for the vast majority of mankind, it has been everywhere necessary to have recourse to machinery from another world. Gods have been pointed to, whose will and command the required mode of behavior was said to be, and who were represented as emphasizing this command by penalties and rewards either in this or in another world, to which death would be the gate. Now let us assume that belief in a doctrine of this sort took general root, a thing which is certainly possible through strenuous inculcation at a very early age, and let us also assume that it brought about the intended effect, though this is a much harder matter to admit and not nearly so well confirmed by experience. We should then no doubt succeed in obtaining strict legality of action, even beyond the limits that justice and the police can reach. But everyone feels that this would not in the least imply what we mean by morality of the heart. For obviously, every act arising from motives like those just mentioned is after all derived simply from pure egoism. How can I talk of unselfishness when I am enticed by a promised guerdon, or deterred by a threatened punishment? A recompense in another world, thoroughly believed in, must be regarded as a bill of exchange which is perfectly safe, though only payable at a very distant date. It is thus quite possible that the profuse assurances which beggars so constantly make that those who relieve them will receive 1,000-fold more for their gifts in the next world may lead many a miser to generous almsgiving, for such a one complacently views the matter as a good investment of money, being perfectly convinced that he will rise again as a Croesus. For the mass of mankind, it will perhaps be always necessary to continue the appeal to incentives of this nature, and we know that such is the teaching promulgated by the different religions, which are in fact the metaphysics of the people. Be it, however, observed in this connection that a man is sometimes just as much in error as to the true motives that govern his own acts, as he is with regard to those of others. Hence it is certain that many persons, while they can only account to themselves for their noblest actions by attributing them to motives of the kind above described, are, nevertheless, really guided in their conduct by far higher and purer incentives, though the latter may be much more difficult to discover. They are doing, no doubt, out of direct love of their neighbor, that which they can but explain as the command of their God. On the other hand, philosophy, in dealing with this as with all other problems, endeavors to extract the true and ultimate cause of the given phenomena from the disclosures which the nature itself of man yields, and which, freed as they must be from all mythical interpretation, from all religious dogmas and transcendent hypostases, she requires to see confirmed by external or internal experience. Now, as our present task is a philosophical one, we must entirely disregard all solutions conditioned by any religion, and I have here touched on them merely in order to throw a stronger light on the magnitude of the difficulty. Chapter 4. Criterion of Actions of Moral Worth. There is first the empirical question to be settled, whether actions of voluntary justice and unselfish loving-kindness, which are capable of rising to nobleness and magnanimity, actually occur in experience. Unfortunately, this inquiry cannot be decided altogether empirically, because it is invariably only the act that experience gives, the incentives not being apparent. Hence the possibility always remains that an egoistic motive may have had weight in determining a just or good deed. In a theoretical investigation like the present, I shall not avail myself of the inexcusable trick of shifting the matter on to the reader's conscience. But I believe there are few people who have any doubt about the matter, and who are not convinced from their own experience that just acts are often performed simply and solely to prevent a man's suffering from injustice. Most of us, I do not hesitate to say, are persuaded that there are persons in whom the principle of giving others their due seems to be innate, who neither intentionally injure anyone, nor unconditionally seek their own advantage, but in considering themselves show regard also for the rights of their neighbors, persons who, when they undertake matters involving reciprocal obligations, not only see that the other party does his duty, but also that he gets his own, because it is really against their will that anyone, with whom they have to do, should be shabbily treated. These are the men of true probity, the few equi, just, among the countless number of the iniqui, unjust. Such people exist. Similarly, it will be admitted, I think, that many help and give, perform services, and deny themselves, without having any further intention in their hearts than that of assisting another, whose distress they see. When Arnold von Winkelried exclaimed, "Troven, lieben Eidgenossen, wollt's meinem Wip und Kindergedenken," translation, "Comrades, true and loyal to our oath, care for my wife and child in remembrance of this," and then clasped in his arms as many hostile spears as he could grasp, can anyone believe that he had some selfish purpose? I cannot. To cases of voluntary justice which cannot be denied without deliberate and willful trifling with facts, I have already drawn attention in Chapter 2 of this part.
Should anyone, however, persist in refusing to believe that such actions ever happen, then, according to his view, ethics would be a science without any real object, like astrology and alchemy, and it would be a waste of time to discuss its basis any further. With him, therefore, I have nothing to do, and address myself to those who allow that we are dealing with something more than an imaginary citation. It is, then, only to conduct of the above kind that genuine moral worth can be ascribed. Its special mark is that it rejects and excludes the whole class of motives by which otherwise all human action is prompted. I mean the self-interested motives, using the word in its widest sense. Consequently, the moral value of an act is lowered by the disclosure of an accessory selfish incentive, while it is entirely destroyed if that incentive stood alone. The absence of all egoistic motives is thus the criterion of an action of moral value. It may, no doubt, be objected that also acts of pure malice and cruelty are not selfish, but it is manifest that the latter cannot be meant, since they are, in kind, the exact opposite of those now being considered. If, however, the definition be insisted on in its strict sense, then we may expressly accept such actions, because of their essential token, the compassing of others' suffering. There is also another characteristic of conduct having real moral worth, which is entirely internal and therefore less obvious. I allude to the fact that it leaves behind a certain self-satisfaction which is called the approval of conscience. Just as, on the other hand, injustice and unkindness, and still more malice and cruelty, involve a secret self-condemnation. Lastly, there is an external, secondary, and accidental sign that draws a clear line between the two classes. Acts of the former kind win the approval and respect of disinterested witnesses, those of the latter incur their disapproval and contempt. Those actions that bear the stamp of moral value, so determined and admitted to be realities, constitute the phenomenon that lies before us, and which we have to explain. We must accordingly search out what it is that moves men to such conduct. If we succeed in our investigation, we shall necessarily bring to light the true moral incentive, and, as it is upon this that all ethical science must depend, our problem will then be solved. Chapter 5. Statement and Proof of the Only True Moral Incentive. The preceding considerations, which were unavoidably necessary in order to clear the ground, now enable me to indicate the true incentive which underlies all acts of real moral worth. The seriousness and indisputable genuineness with which we shall find it is distinguished removes it far indeed from the hair-splittings, subtleties, sophisms, assertions formulated out of airy nothings, and a priori soap-bubbles, which all systems up to the present have tried to make at once the source of moral conduct and the basis of ethics. This incentive I shall not put forward as an hypothesis to be accepted or rejected as one pleases. I shall actually prove that it is the only possible one. But as this demonstration requires several fundamental truths to be borne in mind, the reader's attention is first called to certain propositions which we must presuppose, and which may properly be considered as axioms, except the last two, which result from the analysis contained in the preceding chapter and in Part 2, Chapter 3. 1. No action can take place without a sufficient motive, as little as a stone can move without a sufficient push or pull. 2. Similarly, no action can be left undone when, given the character of the doer, a sufficient motive is present, unless a stronger counter-motive necessarily prevents it. 3. Whatever moves the will, this and this alone implies the sense of weal and woe in the widest sense of the term, and conversely, weal and woe signify, quote, that which is in conformity with, or which is contrary to, a will, end quote. Hence every motive must have a connection with weal and woe. 4. Consequently, every action stands in relation to, and has as its ultimate object, a being susceptible of weal and woe. 5. This being is either the doer himself, or another whose position as regards the action is therefore passive, since it is done either to his harm or to his benefit and advantage. 6. Every action which has to do as its ultimate object with the weal and woe of the agent himself is egoistic. 7. The foregoing propositions with regard to what is done apply equally to what is left undone in all cases where motive and countermotive play their parts. 8. From the analysis in the foregoing chapter, it results that egoism and the moral worth of an action absolutely exclude each other. If an act have an egoistic object as its motive, then no moral value can be attached to it. If an act is to have moral value, then no egoistic object, direct or indirect, near or remote, may be its motive. 9. In consequence of my elimination in Part 2, Chapter 3, of alleged duties towards ourselves, the moral significance of our conduct can only lie in the effect produced upon others. Its relation to the latter is alone that which lends it moral worth or worthlessness, and constitutes it an act of justice, loving kindness, etc., or the reverse. From these propositions the following conclusion is obvious. The weal and woe which, according to our third axiom, must, as its ultimate object, lie at the root of everything done or left undone, is either that of the doer himself or that of some other person whose rôle with reference to the action is passive. Conduct in the first case is necessarily egoistic, as it is impelled by an interested motive, and this is not only true when men, as they nearly always do, plainly shape their acts for their own profit and advantage. It is equally true when from anything done we expect some benefit to ourselves, no matter how remote, whether in this or in another world. Nor is it less the fact when our honor, our good name, or the wish to win the respect of someone, the sympathy of the lookers-on, etc., is the object we have in view, or when our intention is to uphold a rule of conduct which, if generally followed, would occasionally be useful to ourselves, for instance the principle of justice, of mutual succor and aid, and so forth. Similarly, the proceeding is at bottom egoistic, when a man considers it a prudent step to obey some absolute command issued by an unknown but evidently supreme power, for in such a case nothing can be the motive but fear of the disastrous consequences of disobedience, however generally and indistinctly these may be conceived. Nor is it a whit the less egoism that prompts us when we endeavor to emphasize, by something done or left undone, the high opinion, whether distinctly realized or not, which we have of ourselves and of our value or dignity. For the diminution of self-satisfaction which might otherwise occur would involve the wounding of our pride. Lastly, it is still egoism that is operative when a man, following Wolff's principles, seeks by his conduct to work out his own perfection. In short, one may make the ultimate incentive to an action what one pleases. It will always turn out, no matter by how circuitous a path, that in the last resort what affects the actual weal and woe of the agent himself is the real motive. Consequently, what he does is egoistic and therefore without moral worth. There is only a single case in which this fails to happen, namely, when the ultimate incentive for doing something or leaving it undone is precisely and exclusively centered in the weal and woe of someone else, who plays a passive part. That is to say, when the person on the active side, by what he does or omits to do, simply and solely regards the weal and woe of another, and has absolutely no other object than to benefit him, by keeping harm from his door, or, it may be, even by affording help, assistance, and relief. It is this aim alone that gives to what is done or left undone the stamp of moral worth, which is thus seen to depend exclusively on the circumstance that the act is carried out or omitted purely for the benefit and advantage of another. If and when this is not so, then the question of weal and woe which incites to or deters from every action contemplated can only relate to the agent himself, whence its performance or non-performance is entirely egoistic and without moral value. But if what I do is to take place solely on account of someone else, then it follows that his weal and woe must directly constitute my motive, just as ordinarily my own weal and woe form it. This narrows the limits of our problem, which may now be stated as follows. How is it possible that another's weal and woe should influence my will directly, that is, exactly in the same way as otherwise my own move it? How can that which affects another for good or bad become my immediate motive, and actually sometimes assume such importance that it more or less supplants my own interests, which are, as a rule, the single source of the incentives that appeal to me. Obviously, only because that other person becomes the ultimate object of my will, precisely as usually I myself am that object. In other words, because I directly desire weal and not woe for him, just as habitually I do for myself. This, however, necessarily implies that I suffer with him and feel his woe, exactly as in most cases I feel only mine, and therefore desire his weal as immediately as at other times I desire only my own. But, for this to be possible, I must in some way or other be identified with him, that is, the difference between myself and him, which is the precise raison d'etre of my egoism, must be removed, at least to a certain extent. Now, since I do not live in his skin, there remains only the knowledge, that is, the mental picture I have of him, as the possible means whereby I can so far identify myself with him, that my action declares the difference to be practically effaced. The process here analyzed is not a dream, a fancy floating in the air. It is perfectly real and by no means infrequent. It is what we see every day, the phenomenon of compassion. In other words, the direct participation, independent of all ulterior considerations, in the sufferings of another, leading to sympathetic assistance in the effort to prevent or remove them, whereon in the last resort all satisfaction and all well-being and happiness depend. It is this compassion alone which is the real basis of all voluntary justice and all genuine loving-kindness. Only so far as an action springs therefrom has it moral value, and all conduct that proceeds from any other motive whatever has none. When once compassion is stirred within me by another's pain, then his weal and woe go straight to my heart, exactly in the same way, if not always to the same degree, as otherwise I feel only my own. Consequently, the difference between myself and him is no longer an absolute one. No doubt this operation is astonishing, indeed hardly comprehensible. It is, in fact, the great mystery of ethics, its original phenomenon, and the boundary stone past which only transcendental speculation may dare to take a step. Herein we see the wall of partition, which, according to the light of nature, as reason is called by old theologians, entirely separates being from being, broken down, and the non-ego to a certain extent identified with the ego. I wish for the moment to leave the metaphysical explanation of this enigma untouched, and first to inquire whether all acts of voluntary justice and true loving kindness really arise from it. If so, our problem will be solved, for we shall have found the ultimate basis of morality and shown that it lies in human nature itself. This foundation, however, in its turn cannot form a problem of ethics, but rather, like every other ultimate fact as such, of metaphysics. Only the solution that the latter offers of the primary ethical phenomenon lies outside the limits of the question put by the Danish Royal Society, which is concerned solely with the basis, so that the transcendental explanation can be given merely as a voluntary and unessential appendix. But before I turn to the derivation of the cardinal virtues from the original incentive as here disclosed, I have still to bring to the notice of the reader two observations which the subject renders necessary. 1. For the purpose of easier comprehension, I have simplified the above presentation of compassion as the sole source of truly moral actions by intentionally leaving out of consideration the incentive of malice, which, while it is equally useless to the self as compassion, makes the pain of others its ultimate purpose. We are now, however, in a position, by including it, to state the above proof more completely and rigorously as follows. There are only three fundamental springs of human conduct, and all possible motives arise from one or other of these. They are a. Egoism, which desires the weal of the self and is limitless. b. Malice, which desires the woe of others and may develop to the utmost cruelty. c. Compassion, which desires the weal of others and may rise to nobleness and magnanimity. Every human act is referable to one of these springs, although two of them may work together. Now, as we have assumed that actions of moral worth are in point of fact realities, it follows that they also must proceed from one of these primal sources. But, By the 8th axiom, they cannot arise from the first, and still less from the second, since all conduct springing from the latter is morally worthless, while the offshoots of the former are in part neither good nor bad in themselves. Hence they must have their origin in the third incentive, and this will be established a posteriori in the sequel. 2. Direct sympathy with another is limited to his sufferings, and is not immediately awakened by his well-being. The latter per se leaves us indifferent. J. Rousseau, in his Émile, Book 4, expresses the same view. Première maxime, il n'est pas dans le courant de se mettre à la place des gens qui sont plus heureux que nous, mais seulement de ceux qui sont plus à plaindre. Translation. First maxim. It is not in our hearts to identify ourselves with those who are happier than we are, but only with those who are less happy. End footnote, etc. The reason of this is that pain or suffering, which includes all want, privation, need, indeed every wish, is positive, and works directly on the consciousness, whereas the nature of satisfaction, of enjoyment, of happiness, and the like, consists solely in the fact that a hardship is done away with, a pain lulled, whence their effect is negative. We thus see why need or desire is the condition of every pleasure. Plato understood this well enough, and only accepted sweet odors and intellectual enjoyment. And Voltaire says, Il n'est pas de vrai plaisir qu'avec de vrais besoins. Translation, there are no real pleasures without real needs. End footnote. Pain, then, is positive, and makes itself known by itself. Satisfaction or pleasure is negative, simply the removal of the former. This principle explains the fact that only the suffering, the want, the danger, the helplessness of another awakens our sympathy directly and as such. The lucky or contented man, as such, leaves us indifferent, in reality because his state is negative. He is without pain, indigence, or distress. We may of course take pleasure in the success, the well-being, the enjoyment of others, but if we do, it is a secondary pleasure, and caused by our having previously sorrowed over their sufferings and privations. Or else we share the joy and happiness of a man not as such, but because, and in so far as, he is our child, father, friend, relation, servant, subject, etc. In a word, the good fortune or pleasure of another, purely as such, does not arouse in us the same direct sympathy as is certainly elicited by his misfortune, privation, or misery, purely as such. If even on our own behalf it is only suffering, under which must be reckoned all wants, needs, wishes, and even ennui, that stirs our activity, and if contentment and prosperity fill us with indolence and lazy repose, why should it not be the same when others are concerned? For, as we have seen, our sympathy rests on an identification of ourselves with them. Indeed, the sight of success and enjoyment purely as such is very apt to raise the envy, to which every man is prone, and which has its place among the anti-moral forces enumerated above. In connection with the exposition of compassion here given, as the coming into play of motives directly occasioned by another's calamity, I take the opportunity of condemning the mistake of Cassina, which has been so often repeated. His view is that compassion arises from a sudden hallucination, which makes us put ourselves in the place of the sufferer, and then imagine that we are undergoing his pain in our own person. This is not in the least the case. The conviction never leaves us for a moment that he is the sufferer, not we, and it is precisely in his person, not in ours, that we feel the distress which afflicts us. We suffer with him, and therefore in him. We feel his trouble as his, and are not under the delusion that it is ours. Indeed, the happier we are, the greater the contrast between our own state and his, the more we are open to the promptings of compassion. The explanation of the possibility of this extraordinary phenomenon is, however, not so easy, nor is it to be reached by the path of pure psychology, as Cassina supposed. The key can be furnished by metaphysics alone, and this I shall attempt to give in the last part of the present treatise. I now turn to consider the derivation of actions of real moral worth from the source which has been indicated. The general rule by which to test such conduct, and which, consequently, is the leading principle of ethics, I have already enlarged upon in the foregoing part, and enunciated as follows. Neminem laeda imo omnes quantum potis juva. Do harm to no one, but rather help all people as far as lies in your power. As this formula contains two clauses, so the actions corresponding to it fall naturally into two classes. End of section 7.